Hello, and welcome to another episode of How to Paint. Today we're looking at the Novitiates. These are the Sisters of Battle from Games Workshop's Kill Team. So let's dive right in. So I built and primed these a while ago, I think when the box came out. And I'm not quite happy with the priming I did, and there's also a lot of seams and things on these, so I'm going to clean these up first. Luckily, I used super glue and not plastic glue, so 20 minutes in the freezer and it will actually break down the super glue, and I'm able to pull these back off the bases. I found these sampled tile sheets at a hardware store recently, and I thought this could be a good opportunity to do something quite special for the bases. While I have the models off of their original bases, I'm going to fill these gaps with some plastic glue, and I've mixed in some sprue, some spare sprue into the glue, and it makes a nice gap filler. And with those tiles, I'm just going to cut some random sections into them first, and then with a little bit of pressure, I can break away some random chunks of rubble. The look I'm going for is kind of a ruined marble flooring, or like an old church that's been destroyed or something. They already have a stickiness to them, so I'm just letting that adhere to the base. I thought it would be kind of cool to do like a Japanese kintsugi style, which is where they repair all the cracks with gold and things. And so I'm using some Elven gold here just to scratch in some random cracks on the bases. I also have an assortment of rubble here, and this is kind of like a dry board. So I'm just using these chunks and dry fitting some poses to make sure that the models will fit, and then gluing in that rubble on here. I'm going to be using a neutral grey for most of the base here, so I'm just applying this to all of the bare areas of the base and some of the rubble. And then to finish these out, I'm using Gravelord Grey. This is a speed paint, and I'm just applying this over the top of the grey. Lastly, this is some PVA or Elmer's glue that I'm just applying, and then I'm sprinkling on some snow effects, and this is to give the impression of just smaller pieces of rubble. And while I have the miniatures and the bases divided, I'm going to be gluing the miniatures onto some temporary bases. This is just to keep some of the paint off of those nice bases I just finished. These models were primed with a spray can, and I'm not quite happy with the results. You can see there's a lot of grey on there. So I'm going to be repriming these with some white, just to add a little bit more brightness to some of the faces and some of the areas that the spray can didn't quite get. I really like the color scheme in the Chownath book, but I kind of want to just change it a little bit. I want to reduce the amount of brown. So this is just a grim black, and I'm applying this to the tunics that would normally be that sandy brown color. I like the idea of the nun aesthetic that these sisters have going on, so I kind of want to build that up a little bit more. Here's some Rhinox hide, and I'm using this for the sleeves. So normally this would be a paler brown as per Games Workshop's color scheme, but this is just a slight deviation, and I feel like this looks more like leather. I'm also tidying up any mistakes to the headscarf with some white along the way. To shade the headscarf, I'm using the Briar Queen Chill contrast paint, and I'm applying this quite liberally to the neck, and then I'm taking a wet brush and just pulling away some of that color. So I'm still looking to shade, but I don't want to darken the headdress too much. And if it got a little too heavy, I'm then switching back to the white and bringing that headdress back up to white. Next I'm using some orange leather, and I'm applying some scratches and damage to the leather sleeves. To highlight the black areas, I'm going to be using a brown grey, and I've mixed this with a black to get very, very dark grey, and I'm basically using this as an all-over colour and then mixing up to a sort of medium and just adding in some highlights, and then finally I'm using pure brown grey as a final highlight along the edges here. And I'm making sure that I'm using the same technique for all of the cloth areas. For the majority of the faces, I'm going to be using pink flesh as a base coat. So I'm just applying this all over to the face first. And to add some variation to the skin tones, some of the characters will have some Mournfang brown as a base coat. And some of them will have Rhinox hide as well. For highlights, I'm going to be using pale skin. And what I'm doing is I'm taking that base color and then adding some pale skin and building up a gradient, and then working some colors from that gradient to build up my highlights on the face. But before that, I do like to get the eyes done, so this is a light grey on the eyes, just as careful as I can, and then a very, very dark grey for the pupils. And I like to give my characters a focal point. And then I'm tidying up those areas with the original pink flesh or whatever the base color was that I wanted to use. And then I move on to my highlights that I've already mixed from my gradient. And I'm working my way up to pure pale flesh. I'm making sure that with each lighter tone, I'm just covering less and less surface area. So once I finally build up to the pure pale flesh, I'm only using it for the tip of the nose and the very tops of the cheeks here. I like to add a little bit of fuchsia into the original base color, and then I'll use this for the lips color. And then I'll mix fuchsia in with the pale skin and add just a little bit of warmth to the cheeks. And I do the exact same thing for the other colors. Rather than using the pink flesh as the base color, this is the Mournfang brown. And I'm adding the pale flesh, just slowly building up those highlights, and then eventually adding the fuchsia for the lip color and the warmth in the cheeks. And while I have the colors on the palette, I'm using Mournfang brown for the straps, and Rhinox hide for all of the pouches. I'm also using Rhinox hide for the strap that goes around the headpiece as well. For any of the grenades, I'm using a base color of Caliban green. And these colors could be optional depending on how you want to paint the accessories on their belts here. And before I paint any gold on these characters, I'm base coating these areas with Mournfang Brown first. The gold paint is oftentimes a little bit thin, so if you have a nice base coat of brown underneath, it really does add some warmth to the gold. And it also saves you doing multiple layers. For the crack grenades that are still on the belt, I'm just using that original Grim Black. And I'm switching to some speed metal, and I'm applying some chips, flakes, and damage to the shoulder pads. This is just some gentle strokes across the shoulder pads just to imply scratches and dents. I'm also doing the same effect on their knee pads as well. Some of the Novitiates have details on their chest, so I'm using the speed metal to add some silver to the clasps here. And it's a slow process, but I'm also using it to add some detail to the rivets. I want to inject a little bit of colour to the scheme, so I'm using some Mephiston Red, and I'm just applying a couple of stripes at the bottom of each of the tunics. And I like the fact that this red kind of ties in to the main leader of the team, which will be in red. I think the black and red is quite stunning, and it still stays within the theme of the nun. I'm using some Agrex Shade, and I'm just adding a quick shade to some of the accessories on the belt itself, and any of the areas of gold as well. Because each of these models has unique weapons, I'm trying to leave these weapons to last, so I'm just focusing on getting all the base bodies to the same level. And speaking of the weapons, I'm using a Rainy Grey, and I'm using this to base coat most of the weapons. Some of them I did in the Grim Black contrast paint, but if it's a unique weapon, I've done it in a Rainy Grey first. And then to shade them, I've used Null Oil. I'm applying this quite thickly onto the weapon. I just want all that detail to come out. And then I'm just pulling it away from those thicker areas and applying it to the rest. And while I'm at it, I'm finishing out the gold on the other pieces of the weapons as well. I'm using the Pallid Bone speed paint, and I'm applying this to any of the areas of paper, so any of the scrolls and the seals on some of the weapons as well. I'm using a Victorian brass metallic, and I'm just carefully dry brushing this onto the weapons. I don't want to get it onto the face or the model, so I'm just very selectively dry brushing some of these bigger weapons here. And here I've got a Slaughter Red contrast paint, and I'm starting on the Novitiate Superior. And I really like Games Workshop's interpretation of this colour scheme, so I'll probably be sticking to this one pretty closely. As you can see, I've already got the black areas laid out, and some of the gold is already primed in that Mournfang Brown. I'm also using some of that Slaughter Red for the handles on some of the staffs. And I'm just taking my time just to build up each of these characters to the same level. For any of the areas of wood, I'm using Hardened Leather, and this is just another contrast paint, and it works really nicely on a white undercoat. So here I'm just applying it straight from the pot onto any of the things that I want to be built out of wood. And now we're getting into some optional highlights. So this is Scaly hide. It's a nice lime green, and I'm using this to highlight the grenades. And here's some moon dust, and I'm using this just around the band of the cracked grenades just to distinguish the two. I'm just adding a glint of speed silver to the handle of the grenade and to some of the details on the weapons. Just want to break up some of these darker colors. This is Slaughter Red for some of the wax seals. And a dry brushing of silver on some of the barrels. Again, this is optional, but for the Preceptor's mace, I really want the idea of it glowing. So I'm adding a very watered down white into the creases here, switching out to a Mars red, and applying this to kind of give it some warmth. And then using some of that moon dust and adding in some yellow tones to the glow effect here. And finally for the smoke trail, I'm just adding some grey and then painting the very tips black. At this point, there's a lot of back and forth between each of the models. I'm just making sure that I've got all the highlights that I want on each one before moving on to the next. I'm adding some writing on some of the scrolls, and this is a Rhinox hide, and just some very, very light, gentle squiggles, kind of give the impression of writing. I wanted to add a burn effect to the flamethrower, so this is a Genestealer purple, and I'm just very loosely applying this to the end of the barrel here. And then I'm taking a black, and while the purple's still wet, I'm kind of blending the two colors together. And then once that's dry, just doing a very quick dry brush of some black on the very tip there. Kind of gives the impression of like a burnt copper. And the chainsword is very simple. It's some black dry brush, and then some of that Speedpaint silver just chipped onto the front there. I'm adding some silver to some of the gold areas. It helps tone it down. It makes it look a little bit more aged and tarnished. And I didn't want these models to just be pure gold. For the leader, I'm injecting a little bit more saturation into that red with some Mephiston red, and I'm applying this to some of the flatter areas. And then this is that Mars red, it's more like an orange, and I'm applying this to help just juice up some of that saturation again. I don't want to go much brighter than this because I don't want it to become orange, so this is my brightest highlight. The crown is consistent of the Grim Black, and I'm also base coating the power sword with a neutral grey. And because this is a main feature, I'm not going to use metallics on this. I want to try to achieve a non-metallic look. I'm adding some quick highlights to some of the gear around the neck. And for the plasma pistol, we're going to be using sky blue. So initially this is pure sky blue straight from the bottle onto the glowing power coil thing. And then I've watered down some white and I'm applying this to the very edge. And then while that's drying, I'm finishing out the rest of the pistol with some scorch marks. And then I'm switching back to that sky blue. It's watered down just a little bit, and I'm applying this in a few thin layers just to build up a nice object source lighting glow coming out of the pistol. I'm being careful where I apply it, but I'm also being kind of artistically, strategically placing it along the robes here. I'm adding more detail to the robes with that initial Elven gold, and just very carefully edge highlighting some of this raised sculpt. And then I'm going back with the Mephiston Red just to tidy up some of those mistakes. And lastly, this is the pure titanium white that I'm applying to the rest of the details on the robes. As I said earlier, I'm going to be attempting a non-metallic metal look on the sword. So I'm just applying some very splotchy, different shades of grey. I built up a gradient on the palette, and I'm just applying some patches here and there along the sword where I think there would be natural highlights, but there's no real rhyme or reason. I'm just building up those colours as I normally would. Initially it looks kind of weird. You just have to keep working it, going back and forth, switching colours, moving stuff around, and then eventually you start to kind of see like an overall glint or a natural highlight or a shadow, and you just keep playing with that, pushing the paint back and forth until you're happy with it. And to finish out the model, I'm going to be using one of the decals. For any of the Novitiates that have pieces of rubble on their bases, I'm just trying to match those to those initial bases. So this is the Pallid bone for the skull and the neutral grey. And then lastly, I'm removing them from their temporary bases. Luckily this is just a PVA, so it just peels right off. And then I'm super gluing them back onto their new bases with the rubble from the beginning. And there you go, the Sisters of Battle Novitiates for Kill Team. These were really fun. They were kind of time consuming because there's a lot of unique weapons. You kind of have to switch back and forth between colors a lot. They worked really well as a batch paint. Let me know down below if you guys have already painted these up, or if you want to see more Warhammer content like this. If this is your first time to the channel, please feel free to subscribe, like the video, let me know down below what you think. These were really fun to paint. I have been waiting to paint this box for a very long time. Thank you for watching the video, and I will see you in the next one.